to get started. So normally Iran would be here to give you all the introduction, but he is also going to talk about so down to me. I'm Jessica Taft. I'm the Research Initiative Coordinator for the DLI, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to the Digital Life Seminar today. So this is something we're organizing with James Grimmelman, Solon Barokas, Iran Zaugg, and Michael Byrne, who is in the back. And we are looking generally at digital technologies and their influence on society. So, Helen, our founding mother, is currently away on sabbatical. So a couple administrative things. Students sign in the back. Thank you for doing that. Follow us on Twitter at DLI Cornell Tech if you're not doing that already. If you would like to be on our mailing list and are not on the mailing list, please also sign in on that sheet that you will find in the back, or come see me after. We do have some upcoming changes in the schedule for the seminar upcoming, so please do be on. Either get yourself on the listserv if you're not already, or check out our website to see what those changes are. There will also not be a seminar next week because of spring break. Hooray! If you're doing anything fun for spring break, don't make yourself jump. Let's see. And lastly, I'm going to let Sheen give the regular plug for the Good Code podcast, which is on its third episode.
Yeah, so if you haven't already, you should subscribe to Good Code, which is about applications that we're doing. Episode 3 went live on Tuesday, and there will be a fourth episode on Tuesday. And if you want to listen to our newsletter, you can also subscribe to our newsletter. The website is goodcodepodcast.com. And yeah, please, if you have a minute, also leave us a review that helps the podcast get more audience.
Awesome, thank you. All right. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Isabelle, who is a Mellon Sawyer Seminar Postdoctoral Fellow at the Global Language Justice at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Okay, good. At Columbia. She has had 2 Fulbright scholarships to go study and teach in Ethiopia, and her dissertation is on generally saving languages from digital extinction, which is what she'll talk about today. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
It was such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming out to learn a bit about my research today. Let's get the technology working. Oh, all right, perfect. So thank you to Jessie for the introduction. Some of this has already been covered. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on myself. I have a background in semiotics and filmmaking, and then I moved into the field of communication as a PhD student. So this is kind of my first foray into social science. I have spent quite a lot of time in Ethiopia, both as a Fulbright student, as well as all the way back in 2004 when I first went as a study abroad student as part of a Brown University program. That's when I first started learning Amharic and learning the Ethiopic alphabet, which you'll be learning more about in my presentation. And I actually now consider Addis Ababa home. I've spent about 6 years there over the last 14 years, off and on. And my family is based there at this point. So I'm kind of just on a temporary sojourn to New York City at the moment. I'm a filmmaker, and I also am an artist, and also am very tied into the contemporary art scene in Ethiopia. You're going to be seeing some art as part of my presentation, mostly by the artist Abel Tilahum. And as Jessie said, I'm currently at Columbia. I'm hoping to lead a Mellon Sawyer seminar in global language justice, and these are the words of Professor Lydia Liu at Columbia. And this has been a really great opportunity for me to really enrich my own research and also contribute to something that hopefully will become possibly a field in itself. We're working now on developing the first kind of textbook in this field over the next year or so. I also received last year a data science institute at Columbia University collaboratory fellows grant to design a course with a computer science colleague. And we're working, it's called Multilingual Technologies and Language Diversity. And it's going to bring humanities and social science students together with computer science students. And we're going to be looking at a lot of what the seminar looks like the impact of multilingual technologies, as well as how do you build them, how do you use them, how do you evaluate them. And so this is a really exciting project that's grown out of the Global Language Justice Project as a whole, and I'll be back next spring helping to teach that course. I'm also working on my own writing and publishing, and the sort of ongoing motivations throughout my entire career have really been really equity and justice, and most recently really thinking about that in the space of the digital sphere with language, but also with visual culture, and I love to teach as well. Okay, so one of the kind of founding inspirations for my research was my discovery that linguists currently predict that 50 to 90% of languages face extinction this century. So this is really just a massive die-off of languages that's maybe even more catastrophic in scale to what we're more familiar with in terms of thinking about biological diversity and declines in that area. And so this is a map. The red are the ones that are in more extreme danger, orange, yellow, green, kind of going more to places where it's stable use. And then black are languages that have more recently gone extinct. And so you can see that this is an issue that's affecting the whole globe, but specifically certain linguistic hotspots, such as Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. I'm not sure exactly the term for this area, but there's a lot of linguistic diversity in the islands, and also South America. So why are we seeing such declines in language diversity? Well, there are a lot of factors. Colonization, especially settler colonialism, was very brutal to language diversity, to communities that spoke different languages. Globalization, we see more so than ever before, people moving, products, we see mass media moving from one place in the world to other places. We see urbanization, and this linguists point as probably the largest factor currently that's leading to declines in language diversity, as well as oppression. So when we say that languages die, sometimes that kind of sounds like this kind of thing that's removed from the actual experience, which often, people have lost languages, communities have lost languages because their children have been forcibly taken from them and put into boarding schools where they were beaten if they spoke their own language. And so language has really been used, and the stripping of language has been used as one of the means of oppression to really, compromise the integrity of communities and the support systems that exist. So these are histories that are still ongoing in some parts of the world. Some of them, thankfully, have been, stopped. Like in Canada, they're now dealing with kind of a recognition and trying to rebuild some kind of justice in the face of these histories with Indigenous people in Canada. For example, we have this history in the U.S. as well. My question as a communication scholar then was, what was the role of digital technology? So one of the things that kind of sparked my thinking with this was the rhetoric that I'm sure you're all very familiar with when it comes to the digital sphere, that digital technologies are bringing the world together. They're connecting. They're very democratic, right? And you all are probably some of the people who are critiquing that. But I started critiquing that in terms of language, and one of kind of prime example of some of this rhetoric is Facebook's first advertisement. There's an interesting thing about the metaphors.
Chairs are made so that people can sit down and take a break.
Oh, there's an echo, huh? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Desi. I'm really bad.
Final days. That's fantastic. Wow.
Great.
No, well, no.
It's like a symposium.
Sit on a chair, and if the chair is large enough, they can sit down together and tell jokes, make up stories, or just listen. Chairs are for people, and that is why chairs are like Facebook. Airplanes, bridges, these are things people use to get together, so they can open up and connect about ideas and music and other things that people share. Philosophers. A great nation. A great nation is something people build so they can have a place where they belong. The universe. It is vast and dark. It makes us wonder if we are alone. So maybe the reason we make all of these things is to remind ourselves that we are not.
All right, so. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, so as a visual cultures scholar, I think it's interesting, this metaphor of chairs. Does anyone know why these benches are designed with a bar in the middle? That's right. They're designed to make it impossible for homeless people to use this chair as a bench. Okay, so I think this is a visual metaphor for me to think about the way that we design technology or any kind of digital artifact. Langdon Winter talks about this when in his article, in his chapter, Do Artifacts Have Politics? How we design things. A chair is a chair is a chair. No, there's a difference, right? So Facebook is presenting themselves as a place where anyone can have a seat and pull up a chair to the table, right? But then my research asked the question, but how does language kind of complicate that? And are we designing technology that makes it possible for people to use it in certain ways and not in others? Who are we excluding and who are we including in how we're designing technology? Okay, so Andras Kornai, he is a computational linguist who coined the term digital language extinction. And so he took the rubrics that linguists have used to understand and talk about language extinction in the real world, and he took them into the digital realm. And he talks about how when a language is not well supported digitally, the users have a loss of function of that language in the digital realm. So while they might handwrite a letter in their own language, in their own script, when they move online, the email would be in English, let's say. or it might need to be in a dominant script, transliterated. There's also a loss of prestige that goes on when languages and scripts are not supported digitally. You know, these devices that we use, they're not only tools, they're also symbols of prestige, right? I mean, we get sold these devices partly as luxury items. And so when a language is not supported, this also impacts people's understanding of the prestige of their own language, especially youth. And when languages, when young people are growing up and deciding which languages to use in which context, they're very sensitive to prestige and which languages would seem cool to them or their peers. And then the conclusion of this is a loss of competence. So as young people, especially, are not using their languages within these tools, they actually lose the ability sometimes to use them digitally or even outside of the tools themselves. And we see this going on all over the world. From, for example, I've heard in China, there are, rather than the kind of keyboard that we use, there's often, people often use a keyboard that will suggest characters. And so young people now, they don't know how to handwrite characters completely. They only know the first few strokes because they're used to the tool then suggesting to them what that character is likely to be. Okay, so we see that these tools have impacts. You know, in the case of Ethiopia and the Ethiopic script, you know, my children are learning the language, and there's a sense that the around 300 characters within the script is really hard to learn. Actually, it's not so hard to learn, but if you have a sense that it's, you know, this is the inferior script, then, you know, and you're used to using English or the Latin script, when you're using technology, you can lose, there can be a loss of confidence in the society. So why should we care? Well, for language communities, when a language is lost, there's a loss of intergenerational cohesion, identity, and culture. Yes?
So clarification
Yes.
question, would you consider code switching and mixing as extinction too?
That's a good question. So, you know, language is a dynamic thing, and the metaphor of extinction has its limits. So, you know, code switching is basically a form of living language, which is that we live in multilingual societies, and those things are mixing. And in the future, that code switching may actually lead to new languages, new mixed languages, for example. So I wouldn't say it's the same thing as extinction. Is it part of a process of language shift that privileges certain languages over others? Possibly. So it's part of a paradigm in which, you know, these things coexist. They may be part of a paradigm in which people are moving more and more towards English, for example, or where other types of mixing is happening. Yeah, and please do ask any questions. I appreciate that. So David K. Harrison has done a lot of work with communities facing extinction of their languages. And, you know, he talks about a lot of the impacts that go on. And, you know, one of the things that you hear as a reaction to this is that, well, you know, language doesn't really hold culture to that degree. It can, you know, culture can be translated into other languages. But one of the things that happens when language shift is happening is that young people can no longer communicate with their grandparents. Okay, so even if theoretically language could be communicated in the new language that's taking over in that domain, the communication breakdown that happens means that that language is not being passed on. Okay, so this is really concerning for a number of reasons. You know, again, part of the rhetoric of the digital technology is that it allows us access to more information than we've ever had before at our fingertips. But the reality is that most knowledge is not even written in books, let alone online. So we're not even sure necessarily what we're losing with this decline in knowledge transfer that's happening. These might be solutions for future problems. There's like an example of the Nobel Prize winner, Tu Youyou, a Chinese scholar who, under Mao, during the Cultural Revolution, the scholars were told to dig back into ancient archival materials, and this scholar found and was able to test a remedy for malaria that has saved millions of lives. So if we lose track of our knowledge of languages and scripts, and there are so many scripts in this world that actually have archival materials, then we could lose ways of knowing, ideas, and wisdom that could be really useful to us. So ultimately, here's what I want you to think about with my presentation. I want to inspire you to think about, in terms of language and script diversity, what kind of future do we want, and what kind of technology can help take us there. So the contributions my research hopes to make is really to introduce people who care about language diversity to an understanding of the impacts of digital technology, and to introduce people who design and govern and study digital technology to an understanding of the impacts on digitally disadvantaged language communities. And because of the cross-disciplinary nature of my research, I find that this bridge is very often non-existent, and so I'm really hoping to help build that bridge. So this is a little bit more fine-grained in terms of my research questions with my dissertation research that I'm working now to turn into chapters in a book. How are under-resourced languages threatened or bolstered by digital communication technologies, and specifically what are the hurdles in terms of design and governance that disadvantage them? And more specifically, the case study I looked at, how successful have been efforts to digitally support the Ethiopic script and its languages, and what can be learned from this case in terms of best practices for other languages as well. Okay, so just to clarify so that my presentation makes sense, language and script. Often these terms are used interchangeably, but they are different. So, it seems common sense, but I want to define the difference. So language is a system of communication used by a particular community, while the script are the written characters. And they do not necessarily have a one-to-one relationship. So in this picture, you see Azerbaijani signs. Some are written in the Arabic script, some are written in Cyrillic, and some are written in Latin. And so Azerbaijan changed from the Arabic script to Latin in the late 1920s. They went from Latin to Cyrillic in the 1930s, and then back to Latin in 1991 after the fall of the USSR. Okay, so script is often part of this sort of socio-political tug-of-war that happens when a context is going through kind of allegiances or new power constructs. And it's not necessarily stable. And one of the things that we're seeing with the digital sphere is a lot of changes in script use. So a brief history of character encoding. The earliest digital technologies were designed to calculate. So they only supported numbers and other symbols that were needed for these calculations. Over time, there was a recognition that the people using these machines wanted to have some notation written in English. These technologies, the earliest ones were designed in the US and in the UK. So the first characters, the first letters that were supported were those used in English. And at that time, different manufacturers of the technology had their own code, their own encoding. So computers at the base, they think in ones and zeros, in binary. So in order to, encode characters, letters, they had to assign a unique number to each character. And so the earliest standard that was developed was ASCII, and it was a 7-bit code, which means 2 to the 7th. So it had 128 places, 128 characters that it could support. And ASCII developed in the 1960s. It was made into a national standard in the US in 1968, I believe. It was published in '64. And before ASCII, each manufacturer had their own encoding, but there was a recognition that that was inefficient and that they wanted these devices to be able to communicate with one another. Imagine if you have a Dell, you couldn't send an email to a Mac, for example. So ASCII was designed to solve that problem of interoperability. And it quickly became the default international standard because most of the technology was being manufactured in the US and exported globally. But of course, it did not support all of the characters that other speakers of other languages needed. So first, we have the languages, the first kind of market demand was from speakers of languages in Europe that use the Latin alphabet but have additional characters. And so ISO, which is an international standards organization based in Geneva, they regulate everything from the size of nuts and bolts to the size of packing containers. They took on the task of creating basically an internationalized version of ASCII that left 10 spaces for national variants. So you would have ASCII and then you have 10 spots to add in like whatever extra Latin characters you needed. Okay, so this solved the problem for like a few extra countries, right? But not for others who used other non-Latin scripts. So national and industry standards began to emerge in global context in Korea and India and Japan, in China, and Israel. And so this was happening in the 1970s. And of course, with character sets that needed a much larger than 7 or 8-bit encoding, they would have to use other types of encoding methods, which with a larger byte size. But these were not interoperable. So you could not necessarily send, even within Europe, where you have like French to German, you wouldn't necessarily be able to send a document and have it be readable. You would get wingdings or empty boxes, okay? Never mind trying to have a document where you have mixed scripts. That was like technically almost impossible or very difficult. So again, there was a recognition that this technology was a global and that people really wanted to have a universal standard that would allow this global communication to take place. You can imagine if that had never happened, right? We would maybe still be in that paradigm where we didn't have the global internet, for example. So there were two organizations that came to take on this challenge with very different structures and frameworks. One is ISO, the other is Unicode. So ISO is made up of member bodies that are representatives of nation states, and they have to pay some dues to come. They can decide which committees they want to participate in. And Unicode, on the other hand, was a consortium of mostly Silicon Valley companies. And again, they decided, often they're competitors, but sometimes they collaborate. And they said, in this case, we need to work together to build this universal standard. And so these two standards were competing. They had a different technical framework, but Unicode's goal was to bring them together because they knew only one universal standard would really rise to the top. Now, depending who you ask, this was either a peaceful merger or kind of a hostile takeover. The ISO folks, they say, some of them say, well, Unicode knew that they would become the dominant international standard, whether we liked it or not. So we had to just agree to work with them, and they kind of enforced their structure on us, saying that it was more efficient, and they're just vendors, they're just corporate people, it's wrong, ISO is the real representative democratic body because we represent nation states, which are more representative of people. So there's some very interesting politics. I don't have enough time to go into the details of all of it with this presentation. But long story short, these two organizations came together in 2001, 2002 timeframe, and their standards are now in sync. So they work kind of in parallel, and then they come together once a year. Now, Unicode 1.0 was basically just sucking in all the standards that already existed to that point. And Unicode 2.0 was unification with ISO 10646. So there wasn't much beyond that in terms of representation. Now Unicode 3.0 was where they started to expand the character set. And you know, up until this point, this was basically what one of my interviewees, Ken Whistler, a Unicode technical director, he calls the market scripts. So these were the ones, you know, where people were interested in buying the technology. But the next wave, Unicode 3.0, which was approved in 1999, they then went after the national scripts. And this included Ethiopic because it supports the national language of Ethiopia, which is Amharic. And it was the first African language to be, or African script to be encoded in Unicode. And it did broaden the representation to some degree. If people have questions later, I can go into a little bit more detail. But since 1999, there have been continued efforts to bring in the long tail of scripts. One of the really key players within this process has been the Script Encoding Initiative. And this was founded at UC Berkeley in 2002 by a scholar who was working on an Old Italic, which is a script from Italy. And she realized how difficult the process of proposing to Unicode and going through all the technical pieces to get a script approved was. And she said, how in the world, if I am like, you know, I'm a PhD, a linguist in the US, and this is so hard for me, how possibly could communities around the world possibly get their scripts into Unicode so they could be digitally available? And so she founded this initiative at Berkeley, and she bridges the communities that would like their script to be included in Unicode and the very technical side of work that needs to be done. She also provides access to these closed organizations. They're both membership-based, they both have dues. They don't want people to come and watch. They allowed me to come in only because I knew Debbie. They don't want journalists generally. They have a lot of bureaucratic ways, especially ISO in particular, of not having these processes be open, which is the issue with internet governance more generally. We see kind of patterns of closed door decision-making that's going on. But in any case, the Script Encoding Initiative has done a great job of actually bringing people to meetings and seeing what this work is done, how the work is done. And they also work to remedy concerns because there are many cases where a community, there's certain members of a community who would like their script to be digitally available, and then there's others who think that Silicon Valley is trying to own their script and own their language and co-opt their culture. And so there's been concerns that through conversation, the Script Encoding Initiative has been able to remedy. So there currently Unicode 12.0, which was just released a few weeks ago, supports 150 scripts total. SEI helped to encode 89, including an additional 29 repertoire additions and symbol sets. And there's still 73 historic scripts that are unencoded and 64 living scripts. I recommend that you check out their website and you can read more about their work. They, a year ago, they included the Rohingya script, for example, which is shown here. They really tried to push that through as quickly as they could because of the refugee crisis and situation that's going on with the Rohingya. This apparently was important to some, maybe symbolically, and to others, you know, hopefully for communication for people, especially as they're displaced. Now, some have argued that because Unicode also governs emoji and spends a lot of their time now deciding which emoji will end up on your phone, that this effort is actually competing with the effort of bringing in these underrepresented scripts. So Michael Erard in the New York Times a couple of years ago made this argument that emoji is competing, but actually I would say that emoji in kind of an ironic way is actually helping to fuel the continued effort of Unicode. Without emoji, Unicode may have just like closed its doors and said, well, we're done. We almost got to encode all the scripts. We got close enough. You know, this last few, they're not that important. There's only a few people really using those. A lot of them are historic. We can just forget about those. So in some way, I think it's a good thing. And furthermore, Unicode has an adopt a character effort, which basically you can pay money to like adopt, usually the emoji is what's popular. And then that money is given then to Script Encoding Initiative to help their work on these digitally disadvantaged scripts. Yes, Debbie? 20 minutes. Okay, thanks. Okay, so just to be clear, my research focuses on this foundational level of the script encoding because, without that, you really have, especially for the languages that don't use dominant scripts, you have no way to actually use your devices in a manner that is interoperable, and that's what Unicode really gives us. Unicode is the most dominant script encoding since 2007 when it took over from ASCII. So it is an essential form of support. But above that, we have a whole stack of supports that ideally people will have access to really use digital tools to their full capacity. So from keyboards to fonts to locale data to support in software, as well as default support. This is a big issue for people a lot of times. Maybe there is a keyboard in their script, but they don't know that it exists, or they don't know how to download it. I see this a lot in Ethiopia. I always have friends like coming to me and asking me, how do I like text in Amharic? And I'm like, wow, that's been available. Do you know there's even like Google Translate and voice recognition in Google now for Amharic, but people still don't know how to download a keyboard. So often, one thing is getting the supports, and then the next is like making them really accessible and user-friendly. And this is challenging often because, for example, if a script is not well supported and a language is not well supported, people will switch over to using English often or using the Latin script, and this makes it hard for companies like Google to recognize what language they're using. And then if they could recognize what language they're using, they could potentially suggest the correct keyboard to them, for example. But we're not quite there at making these things really user-friendly for most of the world's languages beyond about 12 main languages. Optical character recognition is really important, especially for cultures and places that have a lot of archival materials. And voice is important as well to kind of bypass written communication entirely for people who are not literate, for example, or for languages that are oral and not written. And eventually, we're getting to hopefully a place where most languages can be translated quite effectively. So for my own methodology, I did mixed methods research, including observation of Unicode and ISO meetings, interviews with their members, archival research with both of these organizations, and I also interviewed a number of Ethiopic digital pioneers and linguists. And then I did a non-traditional content analysis of the script use on Facebook and Wikipedia, and looked at other people's data for how much language and script is being used on the Ethiopian country code top level domain. So just to give you a little introduction to Ethiopia, historically, Ethiopia was part of the Aksum Empire. You may know this from the Queen of Sheba, as well as actually Ethiopia is referenced in Genesis 2:13. So this is like right at the beginning of the Bible. It says, and the name of the second river is Gihon, the same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. So Ge'ez was the language of the Aksum Empire, and in the 3rd century, the Aksum Empire was considered one of the 4 ancient powers, the others being Persia, Rome, and China. And the earliest extant Ge'ez writing dates back to the 3rd century AD. And Ge'ez documents number in the hundreds of thousands, including the world's oldest Bible, which was recently discovered. And there's probably a lot more of really ancient documents that are hidden away in caves, because that's the practice there. Priests hide these books, and it's their duty not to have anyone find them. And so there's potential that even more of this type of documentation will come out. So the Ge'ez language is a classical language, much like Latin is for English, in that Ge'ez was written in the Ethiopic script that was then passed down to the modern languages in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ethiopia and Eritrea were, for many ages, one country or one land. You can see, population, the number of languages, and a little bit about the history here. So my research specifically looked at the languages within Ethiopia and Eritrea that use the Ethiopic script, which historically was all of them. So once Ge'ez began to be kind of supplanted by the modern languages, they took on the Ethiopic script, and it's only been in the last 30 years that the Latin script has started to take a foothold in Ethiopia. This is partly due to missionary efforts there, because often missionaries will come in and work with communities. They want to do Bible translation, and they'll work with communities that don't have any kind of writing system, and they will propose the Latin system for them. And it's also due to certain ethnic groups within Ethiopia wanting to culturally distance themselves from the Amharas and the Tigrays, who they feel historically have politically oppressed them, and they see a move to the Latin script, and it's to some degree to English, as a way to kind of create new alliances that are more global. And they also, the Oromo, when they switched to the Latin script in 1994, one of the reasons they gave was that technology supports the Latin script. So we do see that the technology is having impacts even beyond just the use, but even in terms of the logic that people are using about language policies. Okay, so a little bit about the case study and the specific history, digital history of Ethiopic. So, and here you can see some text messages in Ethiopic. Just, I would say, I think it's been about 2-3 years now that we're starting to receive text messages from Ethio Telecom, the national telecom, in the Ethiopic script. So it's, it was exciting enough, I took a screenshot. So yes, so the early digital activity, the first Ethiopians and Eritreans to actually access personal computers were those in the diaspora. So Ethiopia was in under socialist rule from 1974 to 1991, and there was very little innovation in digital computing at that time within the country until kind of the very last stage. But there were many Ethiopians who had gone abroad to study, and they were able to access some of this technology. They were also, as many diaspora are, they were very hungry to communicate with other people, from their own communities who were not necessarily physically in the same place. And so these email lists and chats developed, and people had a few choices of how they wanted to communicate. One was just to use English. Some people did that. The second was to transliterate, which means to write Amharic rather than in Ethiopic, which wasn't available, in the Latin script. And here you can see some actual transliteration of Amharic into Latin. And then the third option, which a number of these pioneers took, was to actually create their own fonts and create their own kind of very jerry-rigged systems for communication. And this is still happening all over the world today. There's people who actually handwrite a message, take a photo, and send the photo to their friends, for example. So, this is not really the past in some contexts. But the main issue with these systems that people developed was they were not interoperable. And quickly people recognized that they needed Unicode. Unicode means that, whatever device you're using, whatever software, you can communicate with another device. So there was kind of a convergence of interests to get Ethiopic into Unicode. Now, Voice of America, I don't know if you're familiar, they're kind of like the US propaganda / journalism source in the US. They also for the non-market scripts, right? The places that weren't buying technology, well, guess what? Those were the same places that Voice of America was interested in communicating with, because they tended to be socialist, or they tended to be like, they had different kinds of political ideologies. And so Voice of America in the early 1980s, everything was done by hand in all these different languages, and they wanted to computerize their systems. They hired Xerox. Joe Becker was the guy who went in and developed a system for them and developed these basic encodings for all these different scripts. He was one of the founders of Unicode. So he had a vested interest in Ethiopic coming into Unicode in the early 2000s. But he then had to find people in the diaspora to actually partner with him to build really a robust encoding to do that. And now, okay, I don't know how much time and how much detail I want to get into. 5 to 10. Okay, less detail. So anyway, the first version of the Ethiopic script was included in 1999, and it did not include all the characters. It included the characters that supported the main, main languages. And then there was a huge effort that went on in Ethiopia and Eritrea to identify the rest of the characters to support additional languages, because other languages have different sounds, so they had to come up with additional characters to add in. And in 2004, these additional characters were included. Daniel Jacob called this winning the Olympics, because for the first time, you could buy a Windows Vista computer off the shelf that supported Ethiopic and supported all the different languages, almost like all the languages in Ethiopia and in Eritrea that used the script. Some additional characters were added in 2009.
Question?
Yes.
So basically the script was first encoded like in 2001 or something, 1999 you said?
1999, yeah.
And then they got the full support for you to use it on a keyboard or anywhere in 2004?
No, in 2004, additional characters were encoded in Unicode. Because, okay, so Ge'ez had its character set. Amharic uses that, but added a few characters. Then as additional languages began using the script, as they, because they'd never been written before, they had different sounds in the language, and they had to add new characters.
Okay.
Do you understand?
I get what you're saying.
Okay.
So when a language gets encoded to Unicode, that's like not enough for you to be able to use it on your phone, right? You need to have you need to have the full support.
The full stack?
With the full stack support. And when did that happen?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so first of all, languages are not encoded in Unicode, it's scripts.
Okay.
So that's key, right?
Yeah.
So because scripts can support more than one language often, right? Now, once your script is in Unicode, theoretically you can use it on anything that's Unicode, that uses Unicode, which is almost everything nowadays. Every device, every software, every website. But that doesn't mean that they actually offer the support at like the level of fonts or the level of input. And I also understand that some devices, especially the mobile devices, only support half of Unicode. So there are other kind of barriers that still exist. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so these are some early examples of like somebody who was like designing a font by like projecting a picture of his Bible onto the wall and like filling in pixel blocks. Okay, so this is like really early efforts. And this is the old Ethiopic keyboard, or typewriter. Okay, so this is just one example of someone he had, of one of my digital pioneers. He was instrumental in getting Ethiopic into Unicode. He developed the first word processor for Ethiopic. And he and others kind of talked about this joyful subversion of making these computers actually work in their own language. And I think that's just one of the kind of rays of hope here, is that, people do subvert technology. It's not always used for its intended purposes. Okay, so I'm going to move now into my content analysis. So I'm using a definition that Cornell and some other colleagues developed of digital vitality, which means there's digital support, but also there's digital use. And I wanted to know, okay, great, Ethiopic's supported. It's got pretty, it's there to some degree, but is it being used? And so these are the places where I looked for support. This is Cornell et al.'s rubric, and I added the ones in pink. Okay, so Simons, this is again Cornell and his colleagues. They argue that Wikipedia is the best measure of digital use that we have. But I had some questions about that, and they do too, actually, to be fair. But you know, one question is, Wikipedia, is it culturally specific, or will there be an uptake across all language communities? And also, when we see in multilingual communities that patterns of language tend to be that more like languages of power, the global international languages like English get used in more professional and formal public context, whereas the languages of the heart or the language of the family is the local mother tongue. How does that translate into the digital sphere? Like, if someone wanted to comment on a New York Times article, are they going to do it in their local language or in English, if they know both? Probably in English, right? Because they're trying to be part of a global conversation. So if we're talking about Wikipedia, where does that fit in? How formal is that, right? So my thought was we need to look at, we might need to look beyond Wikipedia. So first I looked at the .et country code domain. So I looked at 2 different studies. You can compare their percentages here. You can see English, very dominant on the Ethiopian country code top level domain. Some Amharic, very little other Ethiopian languages, and then we have other kind of European and some other regional languages. Let's look at the Wikipedia. How does it hold up? Well, the reality is that the Amharic Wikipedia, although it's called a medium Wikipedia, classified as such, it only has 34 active users, and only 14% of its articles are qualified as real based on Cornell's definition that, it's beyond a certain length, and it's not just like a robo-generated thing that says like, this city is latitude this and longitude this. That's not really a real post. That's just somebody trying to make the Wikipedia look better in the rankings. So sure enough, there is some activity here, but not necessarily the best measure of the digital vitality. So I looked at Facebook, and I looked at the top Ethiopia themed Facebook pages that are most popular in Ethiopia, because I thought those are the places that we can actually scrape, at that time anyway, I'm not sure now if you can still do this, but that you could actually scrape content that would be most likely to be in Ethiopian languages. 2 minutes, okay. So, yes, we see quite a lot of Amharic, we see quite a lot of English, and we see some other mixing and other Ethiopian languages. But what was more concerning to me was that even with Amharic, we're still seeing more use of the Latin script than we're seeing the Ethiopic script. And this is despite the fact that, based on Cornell et al.'s rubric, Amharic is in the vital range of support. Okay, so this is concerning, right? Even languages that are fairly well supported, that are in these 100 or so of our 7,000 languages that have vital support, we're still seeing a lot of impact of the technology's kind of language and script bias impacting the use. So my conclusion recommendations, how can we address this? Well, there's a role to be played by many different stakeholders. Oops, let me back up. So language advocates, we need collaborations between linguists and IT professionals. We need to make sure that the supports that we do have for language are robust. We need volunteers. There's a lot of sites that are trying to, offer support for other languages, and they need volunteers. Of course, there's kind of a problematic side to that, but there is definitely a role for communities that want to increase support for their languages. Digital designers should definitely implement Unicode to make sure interoperability is there. Again, voice functionality, OCR, really important. We need to decolonize typography. There's a lot of font enthusiasts out there. Why not build a font for a digitally disadvantaged script as opposed to another font for Latin? Government, we need an optimized keyboard standard. one of the reasons I think people are not using Ethiopic on Facebook is they can't find the keyboard. There's not a standard. So if you can imagine using a different keyboard instead of QWERTY, every site you go to, you would use a different kind of layout for the Latin. Can you imagine like trying to find those characters? Okay, so that's the situation right now for Ethiopic. Again, they need to use standards like Unicode that are open source and free so that they can continue to use them and the designers can use them and have them be available and interoperable. They need to also put some funding focus on digital supports for their own languages and create a regulatory framework so that their local firms can thrive. International IT companies. I think Silicon Valley, just as we have understood that, for example, if you're a paper company, you're gonna, cut down trees, you better plant some more trees, right? I think Silicon Valley and other global companies, we need to understand that they are impacting language practices, and it needs to be part of their social corporate responsibility that they do offer better supports for language diversity. It's not just a market thing, it's actually a public good issue. And they also need to find a way to reward crowdsourced volunteers because a lot of this work has been done on the back of volunteers. And that's problematic because, the people at Google and Facebook are making large sums. Why not the communities that, are helping them to develop these tools? Digital governance institutions like Unicode, like ISO, like ICANN, like many others, they need to lower barriers of participation for digitally disadvantaged communities, and they need to make their standards available for free and make implementation easy. Now, this is kind of the area where I think my work is kind of growing. I may actually try to set up some kind of a coordinating organization in Ethiopia. I've put this out there as an idea to others, and then they're like, well, why don't you do it? I'm like, yeah, maybe. Well, let's see. If I could help, maybe. Yeah, let's see. So anyway, there's a lot of a need, for people like these, the digital pioneers who do their things on their own at home and to be connected to one another. Often there's duplication of efforts. We need linguists and IT minds to come together. We need liaisons with international IT companies who are looking for language experts and don't always know how to find them. We need to connect academia with the private sector so that this innovation can happen, be funded, and be successful. And we need to provide awards. If we can't pay people, maybe we can help them get scholarships, for example. And we need to educate the public about the supports that are already there. Yes, Sinja.
Could you quickly expand on the IP royalty? What's the current structure for ISO? Like, who owns the overall IP? Because I was just thinking, just like accessibility is now a requirement on most websites, like that could easily be a policy translation, and then all this work would be easy. But if it's commercialized, that's kind of a catch.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So ISO, I believe some of their standards do have royalties that you have to pay to use it. Now with Unicode, Unicode is free, and because their standards are synchronized, ISO is also free, and no one uses ISO actually. Their version of it, everybody uses Unicode, even though they're the same. So it's not an issue in this particular area, but it's important because it's important that Unicode made it free, because at least that's one less barrier for designers to implement multilingual supports. But yeah, it is something that maybe could, this is a whole area of internet governance that needs to be pushed more as free standards. Yeah. Okay, and I guess I'll skip over this and let you all ask some questions. But my last point is just that this research also intersects with a lot of things that I think you all are thinking about with the Digital Life Seminar or Digital Life Initiative, which is, once we support languages of communities that are often vulnerable, we also need to think about issues like surveillance and targeting that become possible because their languages are supported, right? So this is this double-edged sword. Maybe we're going to a place where we have autonomous, instantaneous translation, where people can actually use their own language but still communicate globally. That might be something that will allow these languages to survive, but we can't build those tools unless the basic foundations are there. And then once we have that, and we're using something like Google Translate to communicate across boundaries, we also have to consider what is the role of kind of corporate maybe overlords who are the mediating presence for every form of communication and who own all of our data, right? And could switch on or switch off that capacity at any point, either themselves or others who could hack their systems. So anyway, this is just some bigger questions for you all to think about. So thank you very much. I hope I've inspired you to think about these. And then I'm happy to share my bibliography or image section with you. I'll leave that.
So, thank you very much. We got time for a couple questions. Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much, and thank you for letting us in late. I have a quick question about the Wikipedia data.
Okay.
It sounds like when you say active users, you're referring to contributors to the Wikipedia who are writing or translating articles.
Yes, I believe so.
What about people reading it, right? Because like,
Yes.
if you look at English Wikipedia and you measured it by active users, it would look way smaller than it is, right? Because it's consumed by millions
Yes.
and run by a couple thousand.
Absolutely. So let me share that with you, because I actually have that in my notes. Okay, so this might be a little out of date I think from 2017. Ethiopian internet users view Amharic Wikipedia less than once per year.
Oh, wow, okay.
In contrast, Ethiopian users' page views to Wikipedia as a whole, mostly English, were divided between 91.1% to English Wikipedia versus 1.6% to Amharic Wikipedia.
Got it.
Wow.
Oh, actually, this is Q4 of 2013 because I couldn't find the most recent data. So this was taken from someone's PowerPoint at like a Wikipedia conference. So I don't know how that's changed in the last 6 years,
Got it.
but I don't know that it has, honestly. Asinja.
I'm more curious around about whether you deeply analyze sort of global social political incentives. If you start just from the colonial era, there is an inherent benefit in and kind of writing this even within an African context. There's always the benefit of sort of the dominant political or military sort of society to culturally, and I think China is now doing this with Muslims in China, sort of retraining them. So to sort of assimilate the society that you're trying to control and sort of maintain. So we see that with France pushing for more French set of education across Africa. Of course, English has always been there, it's never left. So given that, do you think there's an openness, politically speaking, to sort of have this inclusive world that we are seeking? Or should we sort of seek solutions that acknowledge that and actually circumvent that? Because I feel like oftentimes we put ideology and then we face the wall, but like the wall was always there. It's like, should we always forget it? No.
Yeah, well, okay, so I think that people, like, I'm not an advocate for people only learning their own mother tongue, for example. Like, they should have access to languages of power, global power like English, French, because they need to be part of a global system. But they shouldn't lose their own language. I mean, we're multilingual by nature, historically, almost everywhere. So there's no need that this die-off needs to happen, right? So, so that's where I would start. In terms of the role of governments, yes, there is a government role, definitely for kind of maintaining the status quo where certain languages are dominant. I think the US in particular has gained a lot after the end of the Cold War. They won the Cold War, their technology became dominant globally, and that helped to perpetuate a logic that English is the international language, right? Mm-hmm. So this is something that we in the US, I suppose, have benefited from.
Right.
But there's also, governments are some of the entities that have done a lot of the most pioneering work on some of these languages because of their surveillance needs.
Right, because I know, like I said, like it's because it's cyclical. It's not it's not like the US is always going to be dominant, just like Britain was. So it's like every 100 years, there's a new superpower or somebody takes over. And the next century is really China's century. So I'm saying that as we look ahead, you know, it's like this rotating
Right.
chair,
Yeah,
but that's only for 1 or 2 languages that
Yeah.
will always be at the top. For the rest of the languages, I was just curious how politically, I think,
yeah,
like Spain, for example, like, I mean, it's dominant in Latin America, but they don't make as much of a global push in its adaptation
Right.
as much as
Well,
other
yeah.
countries do. So I feel like there's some countries that really know what they're doing in pushing that language agenda, whereas others are kind of laid back. And I wonder if those
Right.
could be more allies than.
possibly,
Yeah.
possibly. I mean, in terms of the powers that be, especially if machine translation gets to a place where they can immediately understand anyone communicating in any language, it may be perfectly fine for the powers that be that people are using a different language. They can still surveil it, they can still, and when it comes to corporations, they can still monetize it, they can data collect, they can target advertise to people. Do you see what I'm saying?
Did you?
Can I have you
Yes,
guys
sir.
pause? I'm really
Yeah.
sorry. Any students have questions before you guys need to run to class? We can continue this later, yeah.
Yes.
I have just a really brief question. I thought it was really interesting about the, maybe like using the autocomplete in terms of the text messaging,
Yes.
causing you to like forget strokes, which I totally agree with. I haven't written anything in Spanish completely myself in a very long time.
Okay.
But I'm wondering what can be done about that, or what sort of research is done to sort of prevent that? Because if we take these other languages and actually get them so they have their own keyboards, do we not just bring those same people into the same problems that, you know, the larger languages are occurring?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it depends on script because like the Chinese characters are so like they're stroke based and they're complex. So like that's more of and there's so many of them that was the like most efficient solution was to do a system where after a few strokes it suggests what character you're looking for, right? That's not necessarily going to be the case for Ethiopic, which only has 300 characters approximately. So it's not necessarily the case that exact paradigm will play out with other scripts. But yes, the technology does in many ways bring us back into similar paradigms in terms of, I mean, even it could be rather than the characters themselves, people losing their, grasp of those, it could be like spelling that we just don't.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like in
Yeah,
modern languages.
so it can, I mean, and depends how romantic you are about like good old fashioned spelling. Do we think it's really important? Do we care that kids can't spell nowadays? I'll leave that up to you. I mean, I think the risk to me, it's tough. Digital technology has its pros and its cons, right? Its risks and its benefits, but those have to be weighed by each community. But I think it's hard not to participate in the digital technology at this point in time because there is so much that could be lost.
It's worth the risk.
I think it's, to a large degree. But again, that's may not be true everywhere.
Good, thank you. Other questions? Okay. Thank you all very much for coming. We can stick around for several more minutes if you guys have more questions. But thank you. We'll not see you next week because of spring break, so we'll see you back on the 11th for a talk by Maggie.
Maggie, will be our speaker.
Yeah.